On the China, I don't know if it was rightly phrased, but these regional blocks, what are they? Technically they're a grouping of countries that exchange preferences, right, for collaboration. Now, if it so happens that bilateral engagements are more preferential, then countries tend to turn away from regional arrangements to bilateral arrangements. So hence the urgency for regional blocks to be highly preferential, and for member states to really see the benefits. And that's what happened with SAARC. SAARC, there was a two-tier system of preferences for LDCs and non-LDCs, but bilateral arrangements tended to be much more beneficial. So Bhutan and India, Nepal and India, Bangladesh and India, Sri Lanka and India, or Sri Lanka and Pakistan, those bilateral ties ended up reaping much more benefits than what you would obtain through a regional bloc. So, if BIMSTEC, if members don't see an inherent interest through the regional arrangement, those exchanges of preferences or cooperation on specific projects, then you would turn to. So that's just a fact of trade. So it's not a question of threat or, in my opinion. On riparian issues, there's a lot to be learned in the Ganges, Brahmaputra river basins on how the Mekong collaboration has happened, right? Again, here, given the asymmetric presence, influence of India, you would need Indian cooperation. India has tended to prefer bilateral arrangements. Why regionalize or trilateralize these issues has been the conventional position. But if India could be nudged to take leadership to regionalize these issues, I think transboundary water issues can be governed much more effectively, as ASEAN has shown. But in the case of ASEAN, Thailand is the second largest economy there after Indonesia, but it's not as big and dominant as India is in ASEAN. So cooperation there has been possible. Although one has to point out that Laos, Laos is 5 or 6 million. You have Vietnam next door, which is 100 million. So there is some asymmetry there in terms of size and population, but not so much on per capita incomes. On dispute, I was basically referring to one of the wonderful institutional innovations of the WTO was the dispute settlement understanding, the agreement, right, the DSU, where a country like Vanuatu could bring a case against the United States and win, right? It would be impossible if those disputes were raised on a bilateral level. Smaller countries would be crushed. So it is the smaller countries of this world that need institutional protection, that need international organization, that need regional blocks to safeguard their interests. Big countries don't need that as much. And in that spirit, there could be, it's not in the sort of acrimonious sense that you pick a fight against larger countries, but there are common issues. Let's say Nepal and Bhutan, when it comes to GATT Article 5 on freedom of transit, often very salient. Mongolia and China, again, freedom of transit, right, GATT Article 5. So those issues could be resolved, could be pursued in a very gentlemanly fashion through these regional platforms, things that would not otherwise have been possible on a bilateral basis. It was written in 1775. So I often make this connection to point out that Adam Smith had already talked about the importance of water carries way and the size of markets, right? And this is really the raison d'etre for Nepal to really seek bilateral, sub-regional, regional, and even global engagements. Wealth creation is a result of productivity gains acquired through specialization. Specialization happens through division of labor, and division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, right? So this is really the core principle. So we're small, we're poor, we're landlocked, so we want to extend the market. And this is where SAARC would have come in originally, because we are locked on 3 sides by India. So India is a very dominant neighbor. So relations with India are exceptionally important, bilateral engagements. The rest of SAARC is not so much. And this is where BBIN has come into the picture in recent years, right? Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. There's a lot of activity there, movement there. Even though we don't have a formal secretariat, this is not as formal as either SAARC or BIMSTEC. There's a lot of on electricity trade, on building of sub-regional infrastructure, etc. Now, BIMSTEC I see as an extension of BBIN from a Nepali perspective. And it's important for a few reasons, right? You are looking east. You're bringing in Myanmar and Thailand. And there's a certain degree of symmetry restored. India is so big, but when you're looking east, you're really focusing on the northeast of India. So you're restoring some symmetry and the reciprocity there, right? You could start from West Bengal and then the 7 states of Northeast India, then Myanmar, then Thailand. So that corner of South Asia, we see as a big potential to really extend our trading ties, investment ties. And the sectors that are of keen interest to us are clean energy, tourism, and production sharing. Some discussion on supply chains has already come up. Thailand is the Detroit of Asia. India hasn't been able to do too well on, even though the first special economic zones was set up here in the 60s. There's a curious case study. I won't go into this in detail on why the electronic sector didn't take off here, but the auto sector has taken off. Thailand has done well in both, right? So we need to look at cases from Southeast Asia where maybe some of those lessons can be amenable to application in our part of the world. Now again, Nepal, clean energy is our big currency. We've generated about 3 gigawatts so far. India alone has 400 gigawatts plus, but more than 50% of that is from coal. And there is the complementarity, right? Where, if you look at the diversity in peak demand, in November in India, in Delhi, your peak demand starts at 7 o'clock in the evening, ends at 8 o'clock at night. In May, it starts at 8 o'clock and ends at midnight. So this, variation. We know from classic trade that it's differences in factory endowments that allows for trade and win-win outcomes. So on energy, there's a classic, and Bhutan is doing this to a degree, and Nepal has just entered into a 10,000 megawatt sort of deal over the next 25 years. Now we want to not just bilateralize, but trilateralize this to involve Bangladesh. There's sufficient interest from Bangladesh to in fact build a hydropower plant in Nepal and then take a dedicated clean energy to displace dirty sources of fuel both in India and Bangladesh. But we need Indian cooperation for that, right? So this is where BIMSTEC and BIMSTEC would come in and really facilitate these core trading interests. The other production sharing I mentioned, and tourism, of course. The Lumbini is in Nepal, the birthplace of Lord Buddha. And, from India to Myanmar to Thailand, it's the Buddhist ties that really resonate. And we need to do a lot more on this by building direct air connectivity, air links in these areas. So expanding markets, seeking dispute resolution mechanisms that are not bilateral in nature, exploiting economies of scale, primarily through energy, trading of clean energy, tourism, and regional production sharing, global value chains.
Mm-hmm.